The glass doors of Ridgemont Federal Bank swung open on a Tuesday morning in late October, and the sound of work boots on polished marble was the first thing anyone noticed. Garrett Nolan walked in the way he always walked, without ceremony, without apology, without the faintest awareness that his denim jacket still carried traces of pipe sealant from the job he had left an hour ago. He crossed the lobby, placed a manila envelope on the teller counter, and said in a calm, steady voice that he needed to wire $8,200,000. The teller looked at the number. She looked at the man. She looked at the number again. Then her eyes moved toward the glass-walled office in the corner. Preston Marsh rose from his leather chair, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked out with a smile that had been practiced so many times it no longer required thought. He placed a hand on Garrett's shoulder with the confidence of a man who had never once been told to remove it. His voice carried easily to the three employees nearest the counter. 8 million? Maybe you mean 8,000. Beside Garrett, a 6-year-old girl with butterfly patches on her backpack tightened both hands around his. Garrett held Preston's gaze until the smile thinned and the hand withdrew. Preston gestured toward the consultation room, said they should speak in private, and closed the door behind them with a soft click. He did not go to the compliance office. He walked to the center of the lobby and began to whisper. Garrett had been awake since 5:30 that morning. He had packed Rosie's lunch the night before: turkey on wheat, apple slices, the note she liked tucked beside the napkin, and left it on the second shelf of the refrigerator where she always looked first. He loaded his truck in the dark. The manila envelope placed carefully on the passenger seat, like the most important thing he was carrying. Because it was. On the dashboard, there was a photograph of Rachel. It had been there for 6 years. He had never once moved it. His hands were calloused in the specific way of a man who worked with copper pipe and joint compound, who spent his days on concrete floors or wedged beneath kitchen sinks in houses where the plumbing was older than the people living there. He kept a handwritten ledger in his glove compartment for job estimates and invoices. Beside it, a copy of the estate attorney's report from Houston, which he had read 3 times since it arrived. He had understood every line of it. That was the part Preston had not accounted for when he looked at the jacket and drew his conclusions. Walter had been the kind of man who showed up without being asked. When Rachel died, when the hospital called at 4:42 on a Tuesday afternoon and Garrett drove across town still in his work clothes, Walter had been in Galveston. He arrived 7 hours later with mud on his boots and a face the color of ash, but his arms were steady. He slept on Garrett's couch for 3 weeks. He held Rosie every night, while Garrett sat in the garage with the lights off, learning that grief was not a wave you waited out, but an ocean you simply began to live inside. Walter never said it would be okay. He had seen too much of the world to offer a promise like that. He just showed up every morning until Garrett remembered how to stand. The will had included 7 handwritten words on the final page, below the legal language and the financial allocations. Take care of Rosie. The rest will take care of itself. Garrett had read those words 4 times before he could fold the paper and put it back in the envelope. The wire transfer today was not about the money. It was the last thing Walter had asked him to do, and Garrett Nolan did not leave things undone. Inside the consultation room, Rosie had found a blank deposit slip on the edge of Preston's desk and was drawing on it with a red crayon from her backpack. She drew a house with a triangular roof, 2 figures inside, a yellow sun above, and a row of flowers along the bottom. There was no third figure. There had not been a third figure in any of Rosie's drawings since the morning Garrett sat with her in the front pew of Street Andrews, and she asked, in a voice that carried to every row, when Mommy was coming back from the long nap. Preston returned with the practiced sympathy of a man who had delivered disappointing news so many times it no longer cost him anything. 2 to 3 business days, possibly longer. Standard procedure. Garrett asked quietly whether there was someone with higher authority he could speak with. Preston's jaw tightened. He said he was the highest authority in this branch. Then he added one more word, slowly, in a way that made clear it was meant to sting while simultaneously pretending it wasn't. Sir. Garrett gathered the documents, slid them into the envelope, and stood. In the parking lot outside Ridgemont Federal Bank, a dark gray sedan sat with the engine running. Vivien Mercer was 34 years old, and she had driven 2 hours from the regional headquarters in Charlotte that morning for a visit that no one in the building was expecting. She sat with a tablet balanced on her lap, watching a live feed from 4 internal cameras: the lobby, the teller counter, the hallway, and the consultation room, and she had been watching for the past 20 minutes. She had not come because of this particular customer. She had come because of 7 formal complaints filed in the previous quarter against this branch. 4 of those 7 had used the same phrase, word for word, made to feel unwelcome. The pattern had been escalating for 6 months. When a pattern escalated for 6 months, and no one at the branch level addressed it, the regional office addressed it instead. On her screen, she watched Preston lean against the teller counter and lower his voice to the register that was meant to sound confidential, but wasn't quite. She watched Margaret's hand stop mid-motion over the deposit slips, the way a hand stops when a person wants to object, but has calculated the cost of objecting and found it too high. She watched Kevin shift his weight and look at his shoes. She watched a young woman at the far end of the counter, Dana Reeves, 11 months on the job, look up from her keyboard and stare directly at the consultation room door in a way that none of her colleagues did. She watched Garrett in the consultation room. He sat with one hand resting on the back of the chair beside him, where the little girl was drawing. His face was composed in the particular stillness of a man who had absorbed a great many indignities without letting them show, and who had learned that stillness was not the same as surrender. Before stepping out of the car, Vivien pulled up Garrett's account. She had intended to review his file as basic preparation before entering the branch. What she found made her stop. Garrett James Nolan had been a customer of Ridgemont Federal for 11 years. 11 years of direct deposits, utility payments, and the ordinary financial record of a working man living in the same city, banking at the same institution, month after month. Preston had called him off the street within earshot of 3 employees and at least 4 other customers. The man had been depositing his paychecks into this bank since before the teller named Dana had graduated high school. Vivien set the tablet in her bag, opened the car door, and walked toward the entrance. She came through the glass doors just as Garrett was reaching for the handle from the inside. He had Rosie on one arm and the manila envelope under the other, moving with the unhurried resolve of a man who had made his decision and was finished waiting for a different one. Vivien stopped. She did not step aside. She looked at him, then at the child, then at the envelope. She read the situation in the space of a few quiet seconds. From across the lobby, Preston saw her and felt the specific cold clarity of a man watching the structure of an ordinary morning collapse. He knew exactly who Vivien Mercer was. Every branch manager in the Southeastern Division knew not just by reputation, but by the particular dread that accompanied an unannounced appearance from someone with both the authority and the temperament to end a career before lunch. He crossed the lobby with a smile that materialized from nothing. Vivien raised one finger without looking at him. It silenced him completely. She kept her eyes on Garrett and did not step aside. She extended her hand to him first, not to Preston, not to the tellers standing frozen behind the counter, but to the man in the denim jacket who had just been told that 11 years of loyal patronage did not entitle him to basic courtesy. Her grip was firm and unhurried. "I'm Vivien Mercer, Regional Director for the Southeastern Division. I'd like to understand what happened here today." Garrett looked at her face. There was no performance in it. No practiced sympathy. No expression designed to manage him toward a particular outcome. There was only direct, focused attention of the kind that costs nothing to give and is nevertheless so rarely offered that when it finally appears, it feels almost startling. He glanced down at Rosie, who was staring at Vivien's shoes, black patent leather, polished to a mirror finish that caught the lobby lights, with her mouth forming a small, reverent O. He nodded and stepped back inside. Back in the consultation room, Vivien asked Preston to present the complete client file and explain the basis for the delay. Preston began. With each sentence, the account bent further from what had actually occurred. The documentation became incomplete. His own conduct became cautious, measured, and fully in compliance with federal guidelines. The delay became standard protocol for high-value transactions. A responsible safeguard, he said, that any experienced branch manager would implement under the circumstances. He spoke with the fluency of a man who had told himself the same story enough times that the invented reasoning had hardened into something he could no longer distinguish from truth. Vivien sat with her hands folded on the desk and let him finish. She always let people finish. It was a habit she had developed early in her career. Let them talk until they run out of rope, and they will inevitably tie the knot themselves. Then she opened the manila envelope and read. She read the way she had read thousands of estate files over 15 years efficiently, precisely, with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what a legitimate transfer looked like. The notarization was current and properly executed. The probate court order bore a valid judge's signature. The attorney's letter included a direct verification number. Every requirement had been met. There was no basis for delay. Not for 2 minutes. Not for 2 seconds. She set the envelope down and looked at Preston. The careful neutrality she had maintained through his entire account was gone, replaced by something colder and more deliberate, the expression of a person who has seen the full picture and is now deciding what to do about it. Every document required for this transaction is present, properly executed, and in full compliance with federal banking regulations, she said. She turned to Garrett. Her voice carried a different weight, the weight of someone who understood that an apology is only meaningful when it is specific. Mr. Nolan, I sincerely apologize for the delay and for the experience you had in this branch today. This does not reflect the standards of this institution, and it should not have happened. Please allow me to handle your transaction personally. Rosie looked up from her crayon drawing. You have really nice shoes. The tension in the room cracked open. Vivien crouched to Rosie's level, something Preston had not done once, and looked at the drawing. Who are the people in the house? Rosie pointed with her crayon. That's Daddy, and that's me. Vivien held the image for a moment. Then she straightened and gestured toward the hallway. Let's go upstairs. The private office on the second floor had a wider window and a view of the oak trees lining Federal Street, their leaves turning amber and copper in the late October light. Vivien logged into the executive terminal, entered her authorization codes, and began processing the wire transfer. While the system worked through routing numbers and account credentials, she asked a question that had nothing to do with banking. Tell me about your grandfather. Garrett leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a person looks when gathering words from somewhere that requires reaching. Walter Eugene Nolan, he said, was born in 1934 in a farmhouse outside Beaumont, Texas. He became a petroleum engineer because he loved the layers beneath the earth, the hidden structures that held the world together. He spent 41 years mapping subsurface formations along the Gulf Coast. He survived 2 offshore rig fires, a Category 4 hurricane that flattened his neighborhood, and the death of his only daughter, Ellen, when Garrett was 12 years old. Ellen had been diagnosed with an aggressive cancer that moved faster than any treatment could follow, and Walter had spent her final 3 months making the drive between Galveston and Houston every single day, sleeping in hospital chairs, refusing to let her face it alone. After Ellen died, Walter raised Garrett himself. He drove 4 hours each way every weekend to attend school events and baseball games. He never missed one. He lived in the same house until the day he died, drove the same truck, had his work boots resoled rather than replaced because he saw no reason to discard something that still worked. No one in Galveston knew Walter Nolan was wealthy because Walter Nolan did not believe that wealth was an interesting thing to know about a person. Vivien listened without speaking. When Garrett stopped, she said her father had driven 18-wheelers out of Pittsburgh for 30 years, coast to coast, gone for weeks at a time. Her mother had worked the night shift at Allegheny General. She was the first person in her family to attend college. Before every first day of school, every job interview, every room where she wasn't sure she belonged, her father would tell her, "You don't need money to have standards, Vivi. Standards are free." Sounds like my grandfather, Garrett said. Something shifted in the air between them. Subtle, unnamed, the way a room shifts from cold to warm without anyone touching the thermostat. The terminal chimed. The wire transfer was complete. $200,000 successfully routed to Garrett's primary account. But the system flagged a second item, a separate trust account established by Walter Nolan 3 years earlier under an independent trustee, designated exclusively for the benefit of Rosemary June Nolan. The balance was $1,200,000. Garrett had not known it existed. His grandfather's attorney had not mentioned it during the probate process because the trust operated independently, surfacing only during the final estate reconciliation 2 weeks prior. Garrett stared at the screen. His jaw tightened. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and breathed in slowly through his mouth the careful breath of a man trying to hold himself together in front of a person he had known for less than 2 hours. "He thought of everything," he said. The words came out barely above a whisper. On the carpet behind his chair, Rosie sat drawing a new picture with quiet concentration, head bent over the page. She did not know that the man she remembered as the one who smelled like coffee and always had butterscotch candies in his shirt pocket had set aside more than $1 million to make sure she would be safe long after he was gone. Vivien did not fill the silence. She sat with it the way a person sits with grief when they understand it does not follow a schedule and cannot be hurried by good intentions, no matter how sincerely those intentions are offered. She waited. Garrett's mind went to Rachel the way it always did, without warning, without an orderly sequence, the way memory works when it has nowhere tidy to put its weight. She had walked out the front door on a Tuesday morning with her car keys in her hand, calling over her shoulder that she would be back before dinner. A delivery truck ran a red light on Maple Avenue at 4:17 in the afternoon. The hospital called at 4:42. Garrett had been under a kitchen sink on the other side of town when his phone rang. By the time he arrived, still in his work clothes, the doctors were already speaking about her in past tense. He had stood in the hallway of the emergency room and tried to understand how a sentence about a person could change tense while that person was still warm. Walter had arrived 7 hours later. He had driven straight through from Galveston without stopping, and when Garrett opened the door and saw the old man standing there, boots muddy, face the color of ash, eyes red at the rims, something in his chest gave way that he had been holding rigid all day. Walter didn't say anything. He came inside, set his bag down, and started making coffee. He slept on the couch for 3 weeks. He held Rosie every evening while Garrett sat in the dark of the garage and learned, slowly, without anyone teaching him, that grief was not a wave you endured and moved past. It was an ocean. You didn't cross it. You simply began to live inside it. Walter never said it would be okay. He just showed up, morning after morning, until Garrett remembered how to stand. Vivien looked at Garrett across the desk, a man in a worn denim jacket sitting in a bank office, holding himself together after discovering that his grandfather had quietly set aside $1 million for his 6-year-old daughter, and felt something rearrange itself in her chest. She had been regional director for 2 years. Before that, senior loan officer for 6. She had learned to compartmentalize with a thoroughness that had once felt like discipline and more recently had started to feel like loss. She thought of Paul's voice on the evening he had sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, with more sadness than anger, that he felt like he was married to a job title rather than a person. She had not argued. She had not known how to argue with something she suspected was accurate. Sitting here now, watching a man in work boots hold his composure with the steadiness of someone who had carried much heavier things than this, she felt the accumulated architecture of a life built efficiently around the wrong priorities begin to shift. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. The way things shift when the weight that has been pressing in one direction finally finds a reason to press in another. She reached across the desk and turned the monitor slightly so Garrett could see the confirmation numbers, the trust account, Rosie's name, the balance that Walter had built in silence and left without explanation, because Walter Nolan had never needed to explain the things he did for the people he loved. It was simply there, a fact, the way Walter himself had always simply been there. Garrett looked at the screen for a long time. Then he looked at his daughter, still drawing quietly on the floor behind him. Vivien found Preston in the break room on the first floor. He was standing by the coffee machine with the studied casualness of a man who had spent 40 minutes pacing and was now performing composure. She closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking into place made him flinch. She told him what she had seen before entering the building. She had reviewed the surveillance footage from the parking lot 4 camera feeds, 20 minutes of footage before she had come through the front door. She had watched him approach Garrett in the lobby and make a remark, within earshot of multiple employees and at least 4 other customers, suggesting the man had confused millions with thousands. She had watched him lean against the teller counter and whisper to his staff, describing a legitimate banking client as a potential fraud risk on the basis of no evidence other than the man's appearance. She had personally examined every document in the client's file and found them complete, properly notarized, fully compliant, and exactly what they represented themselves to be. There was no compliance issue. There was no procedural justification for a delay of any duration whatsoever. What occurred in this branch today was not due diligence, she said. It was discrimination. Preston attempted his defense. 12 years in banking. A record of identifying fraudulent claims. A responsibility to protect the institution. He assembled his justification with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it. So often the invented reasoning had hardened into something he had started to mistake for principle. Vivien let him finish. Then the door opened. Dana Reeves stood in the doorway with her hands clasped in front of her, and the expression of someone who has been quiet for too long and has made a decision she knows cannot be unmade. She said she wanted to file a formal statement. She described 3 previous incidents in detail. An elderly woman turned away with a valid cashier's check, a young couple driven from the branch mid-mortgage application, a veteran whose pension transfer had been deliberately delayed without cause. She had dates. She had names. She had written descriptions of each incident recorded in a notebook she had kept in her desk drawer since her 3rd week at the branch. When she had first understood that what she was observing was not professional caution, it was something systematic. Preston Marsh signed her performance reviews. Her rent was due on Friday. She had spent 11 months calculating the cost of speaking and finding it just barely too high. Today she had recalculated. Vivien thanked her. She asked Dana to submit the written statement before the end of the business day and confirmed her account would be included in the formal review. Dana nodded once, glanced briefly at Preston with the expression of someone who has finally said the thing they needed to say, and left. Vivien turned back to Preston. "You didn't protect the bank, Mr. Marsh. You humiliated a grieving father in front of his 6-year-old daughter because he was wearing work boots and carrying a manila envelope. That man lost his wife 6 years ago. He came here today to fulfill the last request his grandfather made before he died, and you treated him like a problem to be managed." She informed him he was suspended effective immediately, pending a formal internal investigation that would examine not only today's conduct, but the full pattern of complaints that had triggered her visit. 7 formal complaints in the previous quarter alone, 4 using identical language. Depending on the findings, the outcome would likely include termination and a report to the Regional Compliance Board. Preston set his coffee cup on the counter. His hand was not steady. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say that the story he had been telling himself could still support. Downstairs, Garrett sat in the lobby with Rosie, asleep on his shoulder. Her crayon drawing rested on the chair beside him, the small house, the 2 figures, the yellow sun, the row of red flowers along the bottom edge. He looked at it the way you look at something that is simultaneously perfectly simple and almost more than you can hold. He thought of Rachel. He thought of the morning of her funeral, of sitting in the front pew of Street Andrews with Rosie on his lap, and Rosie asking in a voice that carried to the back of the room when Mommy was coming back from the long nap. He had pressed his lips together and held on to her, held on to himself, held on to the idea that it was possible to be broken and still be a useful thing to the small person who needed him. The afternoon light came through the tall windows of the lobby and laid itself across the marble floor in long, quiet shapes the color of warm honey. Vivien came down the stairs and crossed the room. She sat in the chair beside Garrett, careful not to disturb the sleeping child. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "Your grandfather sounds like he was an extraordinary man," Vivien said softly. Garrett kept his hand resting on Rosie's back. "He was. He just never needed anyone to know it." They sat together in the particular silence of 2 people who have said enough that the quiet between them has become companionable. Vivien looked at the child sleeping on Garrett's shoulder and thought about the apartment in Charlotte, where she ate dinner most evenings with a cat named Oliver, and the corner office, and the quarterly reviews, and all the accumulated weight of a life built efficiently around the wrong center of gravity. She asked what he planned to do with the inheritance. Garrett looked through the tall windows at the parking lot, where his truck sat between two polished sedans. Rosie's trust is already set up. Her future's covered. He shifted her gently. I need to fix the roof, it's been leaking since March. I've been patching it with tarps. A small, dry smile crossed his face. And I want to set up a fund. Something local. For single-parent families, when the furnace goes out or the transmission dies. I've been in their kitchens fixing their pipes. I know what they're dealing with. Vivien studied his face. In 15 years of banking, she had processed more windfalls than she could count. And she had never once heard a client describe $8 million without mentioning, in the first breath, something they intended to acquire. And nothing for you? She asked. The smile that crossed Garrett's face then was the first full, unguarded one she had seen from him all day. It changed his entire face, softened the lines around his eyes, lifted the weight that seemed to live permanently in his jaw. Maybe a new pair of boots, he said. Vivien reached into her bag and handed him a business card. Not the branch number. Her personal line. If you need help setting up the community fund or guidance on the trust documents, call me directly. Garrett took the card. He looked at it for a moment, then tucked it into the pocket of his denim jacket. Thank you, Miss Mercer. Vivien, she said. He met her eyes. Thank you, Vivien. Rosie stirred on his shoulder. She opened one eye, saw Vivien, and raised 4 crayon-stained fingers in a slow, sleepy wave. Vivien waved back. 1 week later, Garrett returned to Ridgemont Federal to sign the final trust paperwork for Rosie. The nameplate was gone from the corner office. The door was closed. Dana Reeves met him at the entrance with a genuine smile and a paper cup of coffee from the cafe across the street. The branch felt different, lighter, the way a room feels when someone has finally opened a window that had been painted shut for years. Vivien handled the trust documents personally, walking Garrett through each clause without rushing. She introduced him to 2 wealth management advisors who spoke to him the way professionals speak to a client. They respect. Not the way people speak to someone they have decided has stumbled into a situation beyond understanding. The meeting took 40 minutes. When it ended, Vivien asked if he had time for coffee. They walked across the street to Merriweather's, a place with mismatched wooden chairs and a chalkboard menu the owner rewrote each morning in a different color. Rosie claimed a corner table and arranged her crayons with the focused authority of a painter setting up a studio. Garrett and Vivien sat by the window with 2 cups of black coffee and talked the way people talk when the professional scaffolding has been removed and all that remains is who they actually are. Vivien told him about her marriage. Paul had been a high school English teacher, patient, steady, the kind of person who noticed when something was wrong and waited to be asked rather than demanding to be told. He had endured the late nights and the canceled plans and the weekends lost to conference calls for a long time. Then one evening he sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, with more sadness than anger, that he felt like he was married to a title rather than a person. She hadn't fought the divorce. She hadn't known how to argue with something she recognized as accurate. Garrett listened the way Walter had taught him to listen, not with the goal of responding, but with the goal of understanding, not filling the silences, letting the words arrive fully before deciding what, if anything, needed to be said in return. Walter used to say that most problems in the world got smaller if you let someone finish talking without rushing toward the end of what they were saying. Rosie came to the table carrying a new drawing, held in both hands, presenting it with the solemnity of someone delivering something important. It was another house, triangular roof, row of flowers, yellow sun, but inside the house this time there were 3 figures, 1 tall, 1 small, 1 in between. This one has 3 people, Rosie announced. She pointed at the tallest. That one is you. Vivien took the drawing carefully, holding it by the edges as though it were made of something fragile. Her hands were not entirely steady. She looked at the 3 crayon figures standing together inside a house that did not yet exist anywhere except on a piece of paper, and something moved behind her eyes that she did not try to conceal. "I'll keep this forever," she said. Garrett's phone buzzed on the table. His grandfather's attorney in Houston during the final inventory of Walter's safe deposit box in Galveston. They had found a sealed envelope tucked behind a stack of mineral rights certificates, addressed to Garrett in Walter's handwriting. Overlooked in the initial probate review. Being sent by certified mail. Would arrive within 2 days. Garrett said thank you and set the phone down. He did not mention the letter to Vivien. Some things from Walter still belonged only to the 2 of them. 2 evenings later, after Rosie had brushed her teeth and fallen asleep with her stuffed animal tucked under her chin, Garrett sat alone at the kitchen table. The stove light was on. The sealed envelope from Galveston sat in the center of the table. He opened it carefully. The paper inside was yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was unsteady but deliberate, each letter formed with the concentration of a man whose hands had once held drilling equipment steady in 100-mile-per-hour winds and now struggled to maintain a grip on a pen. The letter began on the night Garrett was born. Walter wrote that he had driven 4 hours through a Texas thunderstorm to reach the hospital in Houston. He had arrived with mud on his boots and rain soaking through his jacket. A nurse tried to make him wait in the lobby. Ellen had shouted from the delivery room that if her father was not standing beside her within 30 seconds, she was going to walk out and have the baby in the parking lot. Walter held Garrett for the first time at 3:11 in the morning. The boy had wrapped his whole fist around Walter's index finger and held on for 11 minutes without letting go. He wrote about Ellen. About the morning, she did not wake up when Garrett was 12. About driving to Houston and sitting on the porch of her house for an hour before he could bring himself to open the front door. About finding Garrett in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, trying to make scrambled eggs because he did not know what else to do, and understanding in that moment that grief was not something a person could carry alone regardless of how strong they believed themselves to be. The final paragraph was written in handwriting slightly steadier than the rest, as though Walter had gathered every remaining ounce of steadiness for these last few lines. "You became the man I always hoped you'd be, not because of what you have, but because of how you love. Tell Rosie her great-grandpa is watching." Garrett pressed both palms flat against the table. Tears ran down his face without sound, dropping onto the wood in small, dark circles. He breathed. After a long moment, he raised his eyes to the wall above the stove. Rachel's wedding photograph hung there, her head thrown back, eyes closed, laughing at something he had whispered during the vows, her joy so complete it seemed to radiate past the edges of the frame. Beside it, a photograph of Walter holding newborn Rosie in the hospital, grinning wider than Garrett had ever seen him grin, his weathered hands cradling her as carefully as if she were made of something fragile in ways other things weren't. And next to that, held up with Scotch tape already curling at one corner, Rosie's drawing from Merriweather's 3 crayon figures, standing inside a house full of flowers and sunlight. He sat with all of it for a long time. At 7:45 the next morning, a message arrived from Vivien. "Would Rosie like to go to the zoo this Saturday? I have extra tickets. Absolutely no pressure." Garrett read it twice. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Rachel's photograph. Then he typed, "She'd love that. So would I." He set the phone down and placed Walter's letter in a simple wooden frame from the hardware store bought the day before, between a box of pipe fittings and a roll of Teflon tape. He hung it on the wall beside the photographs and the drawing, then stepped back and looked at all of it together. Garrett pulled on his jacket, laced his boots, and loaded his toolbox into the truck. There was a water heater on Birch Street that had been leaking since Monday, and a family waiting for hot water. He drove to Birch Street the same way he drove every morning, without particular ceremony, without thinking too hard about the numbers in his bank account, because those numbers had never been what got him out of bed. 3 months later, Preston Marsh was formally terminated with cause. He lost his banking license and remained under investigation by the Regional Compliance Board, which had expanded its review to cover the full scope of his tenure at the branch. Dana Reeves was promoted to senior teller after the internal report confirmed the accuracy and completeness of her written statement. Ridgemont Federal announced a comprehensive customer service review across all 14 branches in the Southeastern Division, initiated and led by Vivien Mercer, beginning with the branch on Federal Street. Garrett established the Nolan Community Fund, a small, quietly run operation that helped single-parent families in Ridgemont when the furnace went out in January, or the car transmission failed midweek, or the rent came due and the math didn't work. There was no website with his name on it, no press release, no ceremony. There was a phone number and a single line of text, no questions asked. On a Saturday afternoon in late January, Rosie ran ahead toward the giraffe enclosure at the city zoo, pigtails bouncing, calling back to the two adults behind her to hurry up. They were going to miss it. Garrett and Vivien walked together a half-step slower, the way adults walk when they are not in a hurry to arrive and would not object to the distance taking just a little longer to close. No one had planned this particular afternoon. No one had needed to. When Rosie reached the fence and turned around, she reached back one hand for her father, one hand for Vivien, and pulled them both forward to see the giraffe, reaching its long neck into the high branches to pull down a mouthful of leaves. The two adults looked at the child between them, and then they looked at each other. There was nothing that needed to be said. The drawing had already said it. $8 million had changed the numbers in Garrett Nolan's bank account. It had not changed the man who walked in wearing work boots and a jacket that still smelled like honest labor, carrying 11 years of loyalty in a manila envelope and a grandfather's last wish in his chest. It had not changed the man who walked out with his daughter on his hip and a business card in his pocket and something quiet beginning, the way quiet things begin, without announcement, without ceremony, with nothing more and nothing less than two people standing in the same place at the same time and choosing, in the small and ordinary way that matters most, to stay.